Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shasai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining Dan Cook and me, Pat Ryan, for a discussion of The Moral Project of Childhood, the latest book by Dan Cook. Dan is a Distinguished Professor of Childhood Studies at the Department of Childhood Studies at Rutgers University, Camden. He's also department chair there. You will know him probably through a number of his works. He, in 2020, was the general editor of the Sage Encyclopedia of Children and Childhood. And this came in four volumes. I've heard from Dan and maybe read that it had 1 million words in it. It's a huge project. Congratulations, Dan. I first came across his work in a 2004 book, The Commodification of Childhood, which was a study of the clothing industry, and just fascinating parts of that book about managers and floor plans and advertising and sizing of children's clothing, things that I didn't know anything about. And I taught that book and learned so much from it. If you haven't read it, that comes from Duke University Press, the Commodification of Childhood. But we're here today to talk about the Moral Project of Childhood, right here, and subtitled Motherhood, Material Life, and Early Children's Consumer Culture. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you, Pat.
It's really good to see you. We're on a beautiful spring morning in 2020. And maybe the place to start
2022.
2022. Well, the pandemic stole 2 years from all of us. So.
At least it stole something.
That's right. Thanks for the correction. So maybe we just start with the backstory of sort of what led you to write this book.
Well, yeah, and thanks for allowing this. It's always great to have a conversation and to talk. And I want to say I appreciate having you around and knowing that there has been a couple of critical, strong readers of something I've done, and that's always itself satisfying. So thank you for that. Just personally, I appreciate it. I mean, in a lot of ways, really, this is a kind of prequel to the previous book. Basically, as I got interested in this idea of the child consumer, which I had always thought of as some kind of figure that wasn't only about buying things and purchasing things, that it was a particular kind of character, persona, figure, subjectivity that got built up in many different ways, as you say, in the sort of, I talked about it in these sort of very sort of institutional ways in the clothing industry. But what kept, over the years, as I did other things with children and childhood studies and department and did other kinds of studies, I kept feeling that there was something more fundamental that gives rise to something, so that this idea of the child consumer could be a possible person or persona, in a Anglo-Western global North context. That there was something preceding that. Of course, as historians, we always know there's something preceding, and you have to start somewhere. But I felt that it wasn't just something that just somehow emerged once there became consumer culture in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it just wasn't something that just was sort of an efflux of consumer culture generally, and perhaps the emergence of the middle class family. I felt there was something that was more fundamental, as opposed to something that was sort of laid on other things, I guess is the best way I can put it.
Thus, it was a moral moral project that had roots in a sort of early modern transformation into
Yes.
modernity. Yeah. Well, that makes sense, because that leads to the next thing. If
Yeah.
you could, for those who haven't read it, or even for those who have, if you could sort of like summarize the main argument of the moral project of childhood, that would be good.
Sure. Well, I mean, in lots of ways, it's admittedly a complex book, which you're not supposed to do, but in the sense that it takes a while to get through various arguments. But the basic idea is, conceptually, what I call the moral project of childhood is the idea that sort of modern childhood, wherever we want to start that, is always already inflected and steeped in some kind of moral understanding, whichever side of the the moral world you're on. Even the people we might detract from it and not like how they think about childhood studies, it's impossible to discuss or think about or deal with children without having some kind of moral inflection, some moral decision, some moral encumbrance upon you, upon them. So that's just that general idea that sort of kept coming back to me in whatever kind of childhood studies that I did. But sort of more to the historical point, wanting to sort of find these precursors to this sort of, fully fledged named child consumer of the 1920s and beyond. I wanted to look back into essentially religious texts, because partly, or texts that discuss religion, maybe not religious texts themselves, but essentially the idea that I guess I was going against a kind of narrative that I contributed to, frankly, and many people did, was that this new child, this new parenting sort of emerged, again, in the early 20th century, and we sort of, had sort of gotten rid of the depraved child that was sort of inhabited by Satan, and this new child sort of emerged, and there's a kind of triumphalist narrative. And I always was a little suspect with it, and having read a lot of different kinds of elements of particularly parenting, and I focus particularly on motherhood and parenting magazines, I began to read on and think about how mothers were being instructed, talked to, thought about with regard to their children in the early 1830s. And that was supposed to only be like one of those intro paragraphs, and then I was going to intro chapters, and I was going to go on and just talk about the child consumer in the 20th century. But as I got into the material and got into some of these parenting magazines and these discourses, I began to find sort of the thing that I thought was there, which was this development of a particular kind of subjecthood and subjectivity that wasn't just in the child, but it had to do with the relationality, particularly between mothers and children. And so what I do in the book, I don't know how much of a summary you want, but what I do in the book is I follow this thread of the relationship between what I call childhood malleability, as we all know, the increasing sense that children could be changed and molded by education, by experience, and a number of other things, as opposed to having certain characteristics set in them. But also how that implicates parents, particularly mothers, in sort of their sort of responsibility and their essentially liability for now this malleable child that can go any which way. Who's in charge of which way is the child going to go? And that fell unsurprisingly to most people, talking even from the perspective of today, squarely on the shoulders of mothers in many ways, in these sort of Christian texts in particular, but it moves out of there. And then the last element that I sort of grapple with through all these different chapters is sort of this emergence of discussing children's subjecthood. We sometimes call it agency. Agency is one part of it, but this idea that children have express an interiority, something about them that needs to be understood by others in order to guide them correctly. And so those three things kind of weave in and out of them. I call it a braided dynamic. That if you think of a braid that literally that keeps weaving in and out, they all play off of each other. And so that's the general trajectory of the book.
One thing that I thank you for that, and one thing that so I'm going to I want you to respond to the way I've read not just the Moral Project of Childhood. I really read Moral Project of Childhood in light of the commodification of childhood, and really did think one really heavily influenced probably my reading of the other. So this is where readers can kind of create their own book, and one of the interesting things is how does that sound to the author? But one of the things that if I could highlight some things that are there in the commodification of childhood become more explicit in the Moral Project is the way you challenge historians' attempt to locate turning points. Right? The way that you play with oppositions in different ways. So one of the challenges, to place it historiographically, is that there's a challenge in your work, I think, that's developed and become more explicit to Viviana Zelitzer's Pricing the Priceless Child. Maybe not, and when I say challenge, I don't mean, I mean building upon and challenging at the same time. And that in one way to read Pricing the Priceless Child would be that her phrase, the sacralization of childhood, sets up an opposition between the economy and childhood that wasn't previously there. And I would be interested to see, so one question is, how do you respond to that idea? How are you thinking about that in light of this research? And then, but am I accurate in saying that part of what you want to do in your work is challenge an idea that the transition took place from 1870 to 1930, right? And that there was somehow not an intensely moral discourse and practice of childhood beforehand. And that they didn't just all of a sudden become sacralized, but they've always been heavily embedded in moral theological questions that child-parent, child-mother relations previously. And I think you're on really solid ground if you could build on that. So I guess that's two things. Before I don't want to go on and give too many threads at once, but am I accurate in terms of how you're trying to problematize transformation in one way that we could read Zelitzer? And then just more generally, how do you want to interact with the arguments of this very famous book about the sacralization of childhood and the construction of an innocent child that's outside the economy, but still strangely embedded in it? So how does your work interact with that?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's incredibly astute. You are dead on about many of the things, and I probably could have even been more explicit about it. I took from the first book, I stood firmly on Zelitzer's dynamics of sacralization and priceless child and all of those things. And in many ways, I still find it a profound kind of insight. But part of what always came out of the commodification of childhood, the first book, had to do with that if children were outside of the market, it became outside the market economy, and we know these to be white middle class children, right? If that element of childhood, somehow became priceless and moved out of the economy, then how is it that we have a multi-billion-dollar global industry of goods and clothing? Exactly. And what's the difference between consumption and production and these other kinds of things? And so I think that's actually was one of the driving things that made me want to go backwards a bit more in time. what I found through just looking through retracing some of the history and going earlier and looking through these mothers magazines, which were magazines, periodicals for Christian mothers, but also then things like Godey's Lady's Book and Harper's and all of these other sort of big periodicals that so many people have looked at and looked at the domestic world of middle-class women in the Victorian period, which I don't recommend to anybody out there, because you have to weave very tightly. It's a very heavily tread upon area, but I felt with this problematic that I was having that I was going to see, or I felt I was going to see something slightly different. But what I found in that, to go right to your questions, was, one is that these families and these magazines were not shying away from the market value and children's interaction with market value in whatever way that it came, whether it be goods, whether it be clothing, it was other things. And this is where the dynamic of taste comes in. And I write a lot about taste and how taste emerges as a sort of middle class element of trying to use it as a prophylaxis against any bad incursions that anyone might see, and also as a didactic kind of element. So for many in sort of a white Victorian U.S. Northeast world, taste was something that could be taught by things themselves. I call it the soft pedagogy of things. That the things that one surrounds oneself with, one surrounds children with, and young people would, if you surround children with nice things that you consider nice and beautiful things and things that are uplifting, that would ultimately sort of guide the character of this malleable thing that's coming into your midst. So there actually are explicit arguments and other ways to say engage children in the material world, engage children in the things around them, how they build their rooms, what are the things they surround themselves with. As well as discussions of money itself, the use of money itself as having sort of didactic properties. Mm-hmm. Property itself having didactic elements. Learning between mine and thine, as someone put, is an element of training for this sort of bourgeois middle class child. And so what I saw was not this strong opposition, even emerging for a long time, between the child and the market. And really, I feel like I located, in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, when people start writing about it and looking back 100 years. I think that sort of strong sense that the market and the sacred child were somehow split is more of a reflection of what scholars and others were writing about, at the latter part of the 20th century than what was going on, at least from what I gather, and that's open to debate, in the latter part of the 19th. So in that way, and just to sort of tie that in very quickly, those kinds of narratives in the sort of middle-class bourgeois home that we're talking about have incredible resonance with the same sorts of things that where evangelical mothers were being told, trained, and encouraged to engage their children with the world. So I find those kinds of things. And just for innocence, I mean, I think this is a thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And obviously there's been a significant discussion of innocence, childhood innocence, in the last several years in particular, having to do with a black childhood, girlhood interrupted, all kinds of wonderful, incredible discussions about how innocence is sort of an imbrication of whiteness, and it was sort of never been available to all. And I concur, and I find those very fruitful arguments now. But part of the narrative that keeps coming back is, again, people are relying on the idea that somehow there has been this incredible childhood innocence narrative, existence, reality since the 1800s. And I honestly didn't see it in what people said. They said innocent things, the little innocence, that wasn't like innocent wasn't there, but there wasn't this sense of this sheltered, totally separate being that can't or shouldn't be exposed to a whole lot of things. I think that's another thing that gets developed over time, and I think that's another thing that retrospectively people who look back on the time solidify the boundaries and solidify the periodization in ways that I don't think emerge. And I have to say, from what I read, as much as I respect her, I think in some ways Robin Bernstein does it in a certain way too. Not to take away from the racial innocence aspect of her argument, but she wasn't concerned about that kind of timeline as much as obviously Uncle Tom's Cabin and
right.
The other sorts of things.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I get from this is that any kind of simple proposition that we could describe the evil child and the innocent child's dichotomy as explaining what's going on in the relationship between the rise of consumer capitalism and childhood, it becomes very inadequate. Doesn't actually reflect the way oppositions are being used. Not that innocence and evil or corruption aren't part of the discourse, but that opposition in and of itself is not is not very helpful for the analysis of the texts that are produced in terms of locating how childhood is being positioned. Right.
This is why I like to have conversations with you, Pat. You can put it much. No, seriously, you put it much
that's
more.
How I'm reading what you're arguing throughout your career, and I find it very persuasive. Maybe you could speak to. Forgive me, because I'm going to draw back on the earlier book, and you can perhaps apply it to an example from the new one. One thing that I think is brilliant, and I think you repeat some of this, and I'm trying to remember if this is chapter 5 or what chapter of the book it is, but of the new book, but you have this brilliant argument or theme that you develop in A Commodification of Childhood. And I just really wish everybody would read this and put it in their, quiver of things to look for. And it's, I don't even know if I can pronounce it because it's not in my vocabulary outside of your work. I think you invented the term pediocularity. See, how do you say it is?
Pediocularity.
Pediocularity. Thank you. But what's brilliant is you're trying to capture in a word, in a single concept, something that you find advertisers and commodifiers of childhood doing extremely effectively, and that's trying to see a commercial situation from the point of view of children and youth, and organizing the entire environment, so including down to things like height, but also not just how the child will see the environment. This is what's really brilliant, thinking about how the purchasing mother will imagine seeing it from the child's point of view, so that a whole new language with sizes and with the organization of space gets created in these emergent department stores that walk people toward purchasing. Now, you can vilify that and say, oh, it's terrible for commodification, but what is important about your argument, correct me, and please shade in the complications, is what's important is that is tapping into the agency and participatory competencies of children. And if that wasn't taken as an assumption of the commercializing managers and department managers and magazine writers and others, they couldn't have recommended these techniques. So we have a competent, agentive child very much in the imagination and the discursive practices of a very powerful group of actors 100 years. And I would say with this new book, we're pushing that back further before the new sociology of the child is created in the late 1980s and 90s. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, that's pretty important.
Well, again, you nailed it. And yes, I did invent that word. I couldn't help it. It just was there. But that is probably the central element that I wanted to go from the first book backwards to, because I know it just wasn't something invented by market actors for nefarious market actions. Although it can be, of course, we never leave them off the hook. But what is clear, market actors are never outside the realm of social actors. In fact, I would go to marketing conferences in the present day, of course, and I would go to places where there were brand managers of very big companies and talking up, especially when food was such a big deal. And some of these people who were heads of really big divisions of really big places would say, I don't know, my kid likes this stuff too, and I can't stop him. I mean, it's not like they're all powerful. They're part of a larger element. Right. What it sort of gets down to is in the moral project of childhood, what I began to see in the early texts, in the 1830s texts in these Christian mothers magazines, was the discussion that the child, the idea of the child was increasingly malleable and beginning to be seen as susceptible to influence. The predestination, the evil child was, starting to dissipate. And what was going on is that again, it became incumbent, these writers would say it's incumbent upon you, dear woman, to understand how this child of God is seeing the world and how this child of God is seeing you. And so all your actions have to be geared toward making this child, ultimately worthy of salvation.
Yeah.
So how you pray, what you get angry with, how you understand them, how you punish them a little bit later. I have a whole chapter on discipline and punishment and how that transforms. All of those elements was the beginning to incite women, particularly mothers, to take the view of the child, to engage in pediocularity, to use that term. And that becomes, in our present day, in the worlds that we live in, and in the worlds of imagined childhoods, marketed childhoods, discursive childhoods of parents, of childhood studies itself, taking the child's view and understanding it is a moral imperative for us now. And it's been done in many different kinds of ways over time. And that's where I want to say that there is a undergirding, a seedbed, an underground stream of this all the way through, which is, I don't know when it starts. I don't know how often. I mean, I'm not going to do that, but it certainly is present and seeming emergent in the 1830s with these evangelical Christian mothers. It becomes different with a slightly different when I focus on the kind of less heavily Christianized, although I know they were Christian, but more bourgeois Victorian type people, because that has to do with their goods and their taste, and that has to do with the kinds of things you can give them, and that clearly has a lot to do with the transformation of the discourse about punishment. The elements in the debates about physical punishment for children that come out in the journals in the 1870s to the 1890s are all about, how do you think the child is understanding what you'd be doing with that, number one. So again, what's the child's perspective on corporal punishment? and understanding that you're being surveilled. There's some line in there I have where it's both the child at your bosom, at the woman's bosom, and the Almighty are both surveilling the mother at the same time.
So it disciplines the mother.
Disciplines the mother. It's a heavily Foucauldian kind of sense of what's going on. And then that moves, as you could see without perhaps too much, that begins to move towards the focus on pleasing children one way or the other, speaking to and giving things toward their pleasure. How do we understand what they like? What do they know what they want? Again, that's taking that perspective one way or the other. And you can do it correctly or incorrectly. It doesn't, it's not about whether marketers are right or parents are right in it. It's about the impetus to have to do that. The absolute corruptness if you don't do that, as it becomes, all the way to, yes, once again moving into the elements of the sort of structured consumer culture world where advertisers write about, well, how do you write copy? How do you know what a young boy wants? You have to get out of your they're writing to, the person's writing to copywriters, to male copywriters, and saying, get off your high horse and remember what life was when you were 8 years old, and think about what a boy would want and what kind of language he would want in advertising copy. And so there is just a constant refrain in many different registers and in many different sort of contexts and dimensions of seeing the world as the child sees it, making that the move you need to make. And that has to do with theorizing a child's interiority, which sort of goes to a different way that Carolyn Steedman talked about it. I think I kind of try to turn it on its side.
Right. And I think that part of what, as you're drawing in all of these different literatures and complicating sort of how we understand the emergence of modern childhood as it relates to commercial culture, but also there's just so many different threads here that are emphasized in the moral project of childhood. So the book isn't one thing. In a sense, you broadened it out, or with certainly broadened out even commodification around notions of taste, drawing on the larger consumer control culture literature, but also questions about rights and discipline and other things. So there's this spreading out. So there's just a lot going on here. But I think it gets back to, how do we understand change over time? And none of us have a real easy answer, but one lesson out of your book is both these books is, don't be too quick to think we have a point of transformation. It might be a generative tension that's developed and sustained itself and has different manifestations in different contexts, but a long-term generative tension. So even if as I listen to you and I reflect on the chapter about discipline and the complex nature of a mother's responsibility in middle-class literature for the socialization of children, and the complexity of that socialization, this isn't B.F. Skinner. This is a much more complicated notion of how she will appear to the child, and how that will produce a subjectivity. And as you say, with things as well, right? So there's this whole really complicated notion of intersubjectivity between mother and child that is critical to the production of modern childhood, which is not insulated from consumer culture, but it is embedded in it. I then think about something that I have worked on, actually I'm working on right now, is trying to understand the 2004 ruling of the Canadian Supreme Court, which upheld the exemption that parents and guardians and teachers have to corporally punish children under their care. It upholds it, but it hemmed it in. It made it really difficult to justify or to use that exemption so that you wouldn't get charged for assault unless you were practicing the discipline, much like the way you're describing it. It's the severity of what the child has done is irrelevant and not a protection. There's all sorts of things like excessive violence in there, but their age becomes important. If they have a disability that impedes with their ability to learn from the discipline, then it's unprotected. So basically, you cannot be using corporal punishment against disabled children, any kind of cognitive disability. And so the court is preserving a sort of parental and teacher right to use corporal punishment in a modest way, but they're justifying it to the degree that it is still perceived and has legitimacy in law as being a behavioral technique that'll change the subjectivity of the child. So the whole ruling is from that point of view.
Wow.
But here's the thing, that thread didn't start in the late 20th century, or even in the 1970s, when most school districts in Canada prohibited teachers from using corporal punishment. The earliest part of that discourse is there's a private member's bill in Parliament, in the House of Commons, in the late 1660s, that articulates some of these arguments about what is really going on in the corporal punishment, in the act of corporal punishment. How does it change how students perceive it? What are the masters really after? And which of those actions are legitimate forms of discipline and which of them should be outlawed? So that discourse that's trying to pick through that complicated notion of how you create subjectivity is hundreds of years going. And so I would encourage you, and I would push harder, because I do think the Protestant Reformation, and particularly Lutheran theology and doctrines, are incredibly important. Namely, you are saved by grace and grace alone. Authority only comes from the text. So you're only saved by your own faith, your own belief, sola fides, right? In other words, what you think is what saves you. Your subjectivity does, not your act. And literacy, or the authority comes from the text, not from the church. Right? Those two things impact childhood in incredibly powerful ways. And it's not as simple as two doctrines framing things, but that is a archaeological split.
Yes.
In Christian theology.
Yes. It's a split in Christian theology, and to think about contemporary scholarship and thought is that the normative ideal child that everybody is rightfully railing against as saying this is an exclusively European white child of the middle class is also a Christian child, whether they're Christian or not. And I think that's been out of most of childhood studies talk, religion, and not necessarily always chapter and verse type religion, but in the ways that you were talking about it, about also sort of underlying tensions, underlying presumptions, underlying epistemologies about
the way
about
Weber
people.
attacked and understood the Reformation.
Yes.
Not to say that we have to agree with all of his propositions, but he's doing the history of that religion to explain sociological processes, particularly the rise of the spirit of capitalism.
Yes.
And in some ways, I read your work as working in that tradition.
Yep.
Absolutely. I don't know if that's you would.
No, it is. There's a section on Weber in the early part for sure. I go right to that in that way. Absolutely. And so, I mean, I like the way you use the term generative tensions. I hope I used it somewhere in there, but I think that sort of gets at the core of what made me go backwards then forwards, and not to ahistoricize a tension like that, but sometimes it appears and reappears and with all of the different discourses, materialities, social dynamics that happen at a particular time, and sometimes the same or close to the same tension emerges. And that's the moral, in some ways, the moral project. We're still we've been in the moral project, and we have been, and part of it has to do with how do you handle children's agency and subjecthood or subjectivity, along with a strong belief in malleability, because you can't get along these days in many places if you say children are predestined to be something. There's a strong belief, there's a hope. In fact, in some ways people say that's the hope of everything, and the incredible central entwined position of mothers who are morally and legally responsible, and now that we may have people being forced to be mothers legally
Right.
in our country, it takes on a whole different hue. Not that because there was freedom before everyone had equal access to it, but it's a very different world in those things. And I guess what I wanted to do with this, what I wound up doing, I certainly didn't start off with this particular trajectory in mind, but I did decide to doggedly follow this sort of thread through these things. And I think it's criticizable. It's not perfect at all, even close, but I do hope that it is provocative in a sense, that gets people to think about intertwined dynamics and other dynamics I haven't even brought up in this limited few hundred pages.
I think we could talk for a long time, because as you talk, it generates all these thoughts and ideas in my own head. But I'm kind of to move to the next stage. If you reflect back on your journeys, over the decades, and in the areas that you focused on in children's consumer culture and children's participation and children's subjectivity, and also its relationship to middle-class motherhood and parenting, what do you see as sort of an opening, or not as simple as this is a place we need to do more work here. It could be just unanswered questions or potential areas that people could interact with that field and not enough has been done or thought about. And this could be at the evidentiary level or the theoretical level, or just an area of questioning.
Well, I mean, there's a couple things, I guess, that come to mind. One is totally centered on what I do, right? But that's just how it is. That's what you see. I think the unfortunate aspect of the things that I and people like me do is that the term consumer and consumer culture still has a certain kind of baggage that means, crying children in the aisles, or the emergence of media, and then people want to move immediately to children as media makers, which is a great thing that children do. But again, it's not quite the same that we're talking about. So sometimes it's very unfortunate that discussing consumer culture sort of either is the empowered or the exploited child, and not these larger sets of things. And partly I wrote this in a sense to say, whatever we call this, my argument is that the child that we talk about in childhood studies and in the history of childhood is one cultural DNA marker away from the child consumer. They are almost no different if you take things out. It's the same, close to the same kind of being or figure. It's just here it gets implicated in goods, and here it gets implicated in perhaps labor movements or activism or all the other things that people want
environmentalism
want to see the child. So the moral project of childhood happens with scholars, because there's still a lot of people who don't want me to talk about this part, and how close, and as you pointed out, how early on it was marketers and others, and before that evangelists, who talked about a very similar model to the ones that we of the child that we do. And I have sometimes called this child the darling of childhood studies.
Mhm.
And I wrote something about play and how play has taken the place of essentializing the child. People are essentializing what play is and what play does because middle class people like ourselves want to see our children being creative and positive and not wanting to see
Mhm.
them be so there's that part. The other part that you were saying is I don't think social class in all of the different ways that it could be discussed and thought about really gets engaged as much as I would like to see it be engaged in all different kinds of childhood studies, not just history, but all different kinds. There tends to be a centralized presumption of a middle class child, which then often is encoded white. Or if it's a working class child, then it's more like a deficit model, or people don't know how to imagine it. And I think it comes from the cultural position of scholars, frankly, just not familiar with these things. So class comes in as kind of, for many, just something off to the side, and people focus on race and gender in particular, or disabilities, or other elements of children.
Mhm.
I think a lot of the things that people see and talk about and want to know are products of this development of a particular kind of middle class, which has consumption aspects, has cultural aspects, has moral aspects to it, and probably. I mean, probably I think that has to go back to the discussions of innocence and when you talked about innocence, and we talked about when did consumer culture start or not start, and sacred child and all of those things. I think that those are entwined.
Yeah.
And the last thing, as I just said, religion. I think there's elements of religion. I was just having one of my final classes with a grad class, and I sort of brought that up, and it was met with a kind of, and it's like, well, I said, I know, because childhood studies was started as a field, was started by godless Europeans and godless academics in North America, in the sense of they didn't want to talk about these things. I don't know what their actual, whether they were godless or not. And many of us in this world do not strongly perhaps practice in very particular ways, but it's not only about practices. It's about a lot of things that you brought up, Pat. And I just, at our peril, because what's going on in the United States and in other parts of the world is all based in some kind of sense of religious doctrine, from abortion rights to
Right.
not talking about, not allowing children to talk about critical race theory, to a whole bunch of other things. That's how communities are built. And one of the strongest ways that communities are built and have been built from time immemorial.
Right. And part of the trick here is to get people to see that you have a responsibility to have a competency in an area, not as an adherent, but as a historian or a historical thinker, so that you can engage in proper analysis. And that can be in current sociological, cultural analysis of evangelical Christians in the United States, that you have to have a certain degree of competence to actually talk about those people in any kind of informed way. And then I think of on the religious element, this is a line from Christopher Hill, a famous historian, probably most famous for his studies of the English Revolution, but certainly of 17th century, and a materialist historian. Let me just put it in that broad sense, but interested in ideas and interested in class. And later in his life, he's talking to a group of graduate students, and they're asking him about the 17th century, and he said, and 17th century English political economy, and the English Revolution. And he at one point said, okay, the first thing you need to do is read the Bible. And that really resonates with me, because I believe you have zero chance of understanding 17th century English culture in any area if you do not know the English Bible.
Yes.
You just, because it's referenced constantly. You can't read Leviathan. You know, Hobbes's great work, the first work ever, the first great philosophical work published in English, written in English, unless you are aware of the main source of reference for that work, which is Christian and Hebrew scriptures.
And so many people want to understand historically and contemporarily um, communities of color, Black communities, Black people's understandings. And if you don't understand the extent to which various elements of religion and Christianity are strewn throughout everyday life.
It's not about being an adherent or being
an
apostle of. It's about reading the text that those people you're interested in read, and understanding the ritual life of those you're interested in practice. And I couldn't agree more that I love this. I can't remember the historian who said this. It could have been MJ Maines. She's a former teacher of mine, but I may be occluding it because this is decades old. I was really, I don't even know if I was in graduate school yet. But she said, you know, history is not about your experience. It's about getting beyond your experience. It's about getting beyond what your subjectivity is about, and broadening your subjectivity by understanding that of others.
Finding out how you're not in the center.
That's right. And that's the value of it in the broad sense, in that sort of undergraduate education sense. It may have more to it on the professional level of expertise.
Right.
But this has been a really enjoyable conversation.
I appreciate it. Yes.
Yeah, well, last question before I let you go.
Yep.
And I don't know if this has a quick answer, but I'm not that concerned about time. What's up next for you? Like, do you have a project that you want to tell us about, or one that you'd like to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to say, this all sort of ended, the book and the aforementioned encyclopedia and other things all ended within months of each other, just as COVID was taking off. So it was sort of like an exhale that these things ended, and then this bizarre place. But some of the things that are animating my thinking is I've been very interested in photography for quite a long time. And so I've been wanting to do things particularly with photography and, well, children, but photography generally, photography theory, but also pictures. And so I've been looking into a lot of that and doing a lot of reading along those ways. But I don't have a full blown project just yet to say what it's going to be.
Will this change? Are you kind of making that unusual risk of changing the media that you're looking at, or not? As you look at photography, are you just trying to include visual culture into some of the same avenues of thought you've been interested in?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I think what been wanting to do is to think about photography as a medium in many different ways, and look at histories, of course. And I have to say, going into kind of an area that I've been interested in as a practitioner more than a scholar, but sort of leaving that as like, this is what I like to do, and only reading here and there. But getting into the literature and the research, there's really incredible, interesting things that people have been doing. I was a little worried that things were stuck in 1980s lit crit thinking,
Yeah.
which, and it's not. There's incredible studies of, with notions of circulations, which clearly goes into circulations of children, circulations of bodies, circulations of
Right.
ideas. There's significant work. People are doing incredible things on portraiture that if you don't think of portraiture as anything other than portraiture, then you find out, of course, that once somebody scratches the surface with a sharp mind, like a lot of these people do, a whole world opens up about who did what, where, what was the technological issues, what were the ideological situations.
Right.
It's really something.
I'm kind of thinking about this in terms of my own interest, but I am thinking about your era, the era that you have spent most of your time on, and that is the era of the camera, the camera's
exactly.
invention, the cameras, I think it's the gold rush in the late 1840s out west is sort of the first big episode, the Civil War is full on, but all the way to Lewis Hine, James Agee, and others that contributed to this. And those two, the last two I mentioned, Hine and Agee's, they're part of the discourse of childhood.
Yes.
I don't know if you can even think really clearly about child labor reform in America, at least, without thinking about the National Child Labor Committee's use of image.
Absolutely. And you're dead on, because the era of modern childhood, as we might say, the modern child is essentially overlapping with the era of photography.
Right.
Absolutely. Just 1839, so there's something there that some people do things. I mean, there's a lot about the innocent child, right? Because you have, I know you don't have time, but you have Lewis Carroll and his pictures and all of the concerns or the elements of that, and Anne Higonet's work on pictures of innocence and those kinds of images of children that I think set the tone for the contemporary discourse about childhood innocence in some ways.
Yeah, and there's we've had some things up on shcy.org about visual culture. Lauren Lerner wrote a commentary. It's not on a podcast like this will be, but if you go to shcy.org and look up Lauren Lerner, you'll see she put together a really long visual essay that runs through her career. At the end of her career, well, she's still working, but she's emeritus now, and it's a really the images are just striking, and they're just drawn out of different articles that she's written, and then she has paragraphs that describe them. So that's, some people are interested in thinking a little bit more about visual culture and childhood and family and motherhood. Those all intersect. She has that's a place to start.
Excellent.
I think it's a real visual feast, and I think
hopefully the listeners, watchers, this strikes something with them, or maybe they're working on things too.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot out there. Well, Dan, I hope we can get together and see each other in person soon.
It would be good.
And
I think so.
I don't know if you're going to have a chance to get up to Guelph for SHSAI's 2023 conference in June next year.
Okay. I don't know. I'll have to look at it.
Yeah, check out that if that's something you can journey to, and then we'll just have to look for opportunities to meet.
Absolutely.
When we're in the same place, because it's been a long time.
It has, and I think all things going well. I think hopefully things are opening up. So I think everybody's going to get a little more comfortable doing things.
Let's hope so.
I appreciate all the things you've done outside of this with SHCY and all the things that you do to keep everything moving in interesting ways and in dynamic ways. And I also, of course, appreciate you doing this with me. But yeah, you're bigger than this podcast.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. It's obviously a privilege to be in this community, to be able to do this kind of work, and to be able to spend your days interacting, speaking with, reading, writing, and exploring the questions that we do. So I feel
Definitely
the
is.
same sense of gratitude toward all the things you've produced, and to your program in Rutgers and all your colleagues there. That's been an important touchstone for many of us that have created programs of our own for undergraduates in childhood studies.
Excellent.
So, take care, Dan.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Shusai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.